Hello again. Today we've got another video about my novel Hill 112 about D-Day and the Battle for Normandy, and that's partly to complete the series I've been doing on the particular aspects of writing about each of the three main characters and the sort of experiences I was trying to convey, but also because the paperback edition will be released tomorrow on the 5th of December 2024, so the paperback is always the thing that really matters with a novel, because unless you're one of the big names, you're not going to sell vast quantities of hardbacks because they're expensive, they're more for collectors and those who are desperate for the next installment and like a good thing on their shelf, but they're less convenient to carry on the train and read on the train or on wherever you might be going and hold and read in the bath, that sort of thing. So today we're going to look at Mark's War. We're going to complete the trio of videos where we've done James's War, about James, the commander of a troop of Sherman tanks in an armoured regiment. Then last time we had Bill's War. Bill's the Bren gunner, so he's an infantryman in a rifle section in the same battalion as Mark, but with the ranker's perspective on how you're treated, what you know, what you don't know. And now we're looking at Mark. Mark is commander of a platoon in the Glamorganshire regiment, in this battalion of this fictional regiment that I've created, and whose actions are based upon those of real battalions from DCLI at times, the Tyneside Scottish, the Dorsets once or twice. Everything is based on real action, other than some of the patrolling, which is generic of the sort of thing that went on. So in each case I've read a little bit from the book to give a flavour, and then I've talked about the sort of things I was trying to convey, what I felt was important. The essence of the whole book is about trying to convey a sense of what it was like for a 19, 20-year-old from a fairly sheltered background who's then gone through the experience of being in the army, who's come basically from school into the war, and now is landed on occupied Europe and has to fight their way through the bocage country that had its perils, but also the more open country slightly to the east, which has dangers in a different way. So into one of the most intensive attritional battles fought in the West, certainly in scale, but in sheer cost. And this goes back to an idea I've talked about in earlier videos, that I don't think people realize that commemorations tend always to be about D-Day itself. June the 6th attracts the attention, and particularly the interest in recent years, reasonably enough, has been about the planning, about the decision, about the pressure on Eisenhower in particular to, do you actually give that order? Do you go? And all the planning, the logistics around that pressure give you limited options. And then, of course, the weather forecasting. I think there's a film coming out about that, or being made about that aspect of it. And they did, not in this recent commemoration, but the year before, they did a big thing about Stag and the prediction of the weather and that brief window. They felt they had to go because, of course, the big storm that wrecked one of the Mulberries and damaged the other. So often, again, it's partly that's a very human thing, those choices that people have to make, knowing that great responsibility, but it's also budget-wise. You don't have to be quite so spectacular when you can do this as a stage play, you can do this as a film without requiring the massive budget of getting landing craft and tanks and thousands of extras and all of these things. So anyway, today we're going to be talking about Mark Crawford, who's the remaining one of our trio of boys who've all gone to the same prep school in this unnamed small Welsh town on the coast near Cardiff. Welsh, but in the part of Wales that was then and still is to a great extent heavily anglicised, and where concepts of identity were rather different. I've tried to reflect how people thought in 1944 rather than all of the ideas and the trends that have developed since then. But I think let's go first of all to a section of the book and read from it, and then after that I can talk about what I was trying to do. So this bit comes from D+19, which was Sunday the 25th of June, and begins in the early hours in Normandy. So something dramatic's just happened, which I'm not going to spoil, because if you haven't read the story, then it's it's one of those moments that I don't want to spoil the surprise and the shock. So let's begin here. Jackson put his hand on Mark's shoulder. Lead them. If you don't, I will find someone who will, but they need a leader now. Mark managed to nod. I'll go, he gasped. His rear section was almost level with him. Good. Jackson patted him and then took his hand away. What matters is what happens now. The past is gone. Don't lose the barrage. Mark nodded. He spotted Corporal Thomas, a section commander. Thomas, you're acting sergeant. Reese, you're in charge of the section. Pick someone as Lance Jack. It was easier to do than to think. Mark ran forward to rejoin his HQ. Thomas jogged with him. The Sten gun lay where it had fallen. Mark wanted nothing to do with it. In the flickering light of the explosions, he could see the platoon on his right a little ahead of his own. Watch things here, he told Thomas, then ran to urge his leading sections to speed up. This was what they called a creeping barrage, and every few minutes the gunners would adjust the inclination of their gun barrel and the size of the charge so that the aiming point shifted forward by 100 or 200 yards. A well-prepared and dug-in enemy was hard to kill, no matter how much explosive was thrown onto a patch of land. Most would survive. Stunned and bludgeoned, but they would survive. The trick was to keep them wary and with their heads down until the attacking infantry were on top of them. That meant that the leading men had to keep close behind the bursting shells, so close that the odd bit of shrapnel was bound to land among them, and the blast would feel like being punched hard in the head and chest. If anything landed short, because the settings were wrong, the gun barrel too worn, or the charge not as reliable as usual, then it was bound to fall right on top of them. The theory was that the casualties risked in this way ought to be lighter than those bound to occur if the infantry hung back, and gave the defenders time to man their machine guns. Up with his leading sections, Mark did not want to go forward. Even this short distance closer, the exploding shells seemed far louder, the flashes far brighter. Every wave of blast coming back over them was like the gust of a storm. "Keep up," he shouted. "Keep going!" The man in the section to his right stumbled and fell. "Leave him!" Mark screamed. His voice was getting higher pitched with every moment, and he must have sounded positively boyish. "Leave him for the stretcher-bearers!" "I'm all right. Go on, boy," the man said to the mate who was hovering over him. Friendship was one thing, but the instinct to help combined with the excuse to go back could mean that for every man hit, 2, 3, or 4 were out of action helping him away. "Keep going!" Mark jogged a little closer to the fallen man, whose thigh had been badly slashed by a piece of shrapnel. "I'm all right, sir, I'm all right." The soldier was fumbling with his dressing, but though he wanted to do it for him, Mark knew that he could not stop. Already his HQ was getting close. He saw Jackson and wondered whether the major was checking on him. Mark went back to the forward line. "Come on, keep going," he called. His voice was hoarse, the rank stench of the explosives chokingly heavy in the air, but he made himself shout, "Keep going, keep going! Don't think, don't stop, just keep moving." A shell burst behind him, behind even his rear section. No one seemed to fall. Evans appeared beside him, face taut and very pale. "You don't need to be up here, Evans," Mark shouted, because that was the only way to be heard. "I'm your honor, sir, it's my job." "Then stay with me," Mark checked his watch. "Stop! Stop!" There was a minute before the next shift forward for the barrage. Without orders, men crouched or knelt down, waiting. There was a pause, a strange, uneasy silence. More shells landed, again behind him. He heard Major Jackson shouting something, turned, saw him. Then there was a blast of flame and earth flung high. The Major was not there when it cleared. Shells started to pound the hedgerow and trees 200 yards ahead. "Right! Get up! Get moving!" Some obeyed straight away, some after hesitation. "Move! Move! Get going!" Mark yelled. The rest stood and started to walk forward again. I'm going to miss out a bit where we switch to where Judd is and A Company, so we're back to Mark's D Company. 07:45 hours. Mark's men were pinned down by Spandaus with their insanely fast bursts of fire. They lay, pressing as close to the earth as they could, while the bullets snapped overhead, cutting through the heads of corn and showering them with bits of the plants. Mark lay with them. He had twice tried to get them moving, standing up, lobbing a smoke grenade forward and urging them on. Evans always sprang up behind him, and so did 1 or 2 others. But then the German gunners adjusted their aim, and the stream of bullets hissed through the field, and they all dived back down again. He was not even sure where the machine guns were. There were 2, perhaps more, but staying up to spot them would surely have been suicide. There was a clatter of tracks and the roar of an engine, all coming from behind them, hopefully friendly. The tank stopped, and another, further away, began to advance. Machine guns fired, the slow, steady beat of an Allied gun. Then a cannon boomed. Mark got onto his knees, then straightened and tried to see out. The orchard wall was smashed in a couple of places, with Tracer dancing overhead to throw up more dust as it struck. Behind him were a couple of Churchills, rather old-fashioned looking tanks, lower than a Sherman, with longer hulls like something out of the Great War and a boxy turret on top. Mark stood. "Come on!" he bellowed as loud as his parched voice would allow. It was only a few hours into the attack and he had already drained his canteen. "Come on, 17 platoon!" Evans, reliable Evans, was next to him, his head seeming smaller than ever under his tin hat, but his face determined and his rifle ready. Other men started to appear and the Spandaus were no longer firing. Mark ran towards the orchard, trusting that the tank men would see him and not shoot him down. He had his revolver in one hand and was waving it in the air. "Come on, 17! Come on! Follow me!" He tripped in the corn, staggered, regained his balance and kept going and was out into the open, scrubby grass just in front of the wall. "Sir!" Evans shouted a warning. He had a grenade in his hand and lobbed it over the wall. More and more men were joining them. By the time it went off with a dull boom, almost half of the platoon was there. They scrambled over a great gash in the stonework made by one of the Churchill's shells. Yards away, a German lay sprawled in a strange, ungainly posture, as if all his joints had gone. He was covered in dust, eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. There was an odd smell to add to the reek of cordite and death, something Mark had never smelled before. Apart from the one corpse, there were piles of empty cartridge cases, a helmet upended on the ground, and a rifle with a broken stock. Thomas appeared, grinning, giving him the thumbs up. There were about 20 men from the platoon, all clustered together, relieved to be alive and to have got this far. Mark turned to wave back at the tank commanders. As he did so, something streaked across the field from the left and struck the hull of the nearest tank. Smoke started to curl up from it, and men were scrambling to get out. The other Churchill reversed, firing off smoke bombs from its discharger to hide from the unseen enemy gun. "Take cover!" Thomas was screaming at them, and Mark heard the whistle of shells. 4 big explosions ripped through the lines of apple trees, snapping off branches and shattering a few of the trunks. Jagged pieces of wood as well as metal flailed through the air. Moments later, another 4 shells came in. Mark and his platoon were lucky because most of the shells landed near the centre of the orchard and they were on the edge, but the luck only went so far. The third salvo was wilder than the others, and one shell landed almost on top of them. A soldier was cut in two, his innards spilling out onto the earth. Beside him, a lance corporal lay dead, without a scratch on him, but killed by the blast. 3 more men were wounded, bleeding from splinters driven into them. After a minute or so, Mark got to his feet, surveying the destruction. He spat because his mouth was full of dirt and it was hard to speak. "We have to go on! Get to the other side!" He gestured at the far wall. "Get moving! Get moving! Come on, you heard the officer! Get on your bloody feet!" Thomas was sounding more and more like a sergeant. Evans offered Mark a canteen. "Charlie won't need it anymore," he explained, and Mark realised that he must have got it from one of the dead. Such things no longer seemed to matter, and he took a long swig. That was better. "Come on," he said. They've got this place zeroed in, so we're not staying here. Arnold!" He looked at the least hurt of the wounded, a man with splinters in his leg, but still able to stand up. "Do what you can and wait to be picked up." Arnold nodded, his face a little blank. "Come on!" Mark felt a surge in energy, as if the water from the canteen had been something stronger. He ran towards the far side of the orchard, jumping over tree roots in his path and waving his right arm to beckon the others on. There was an iron gate in the far wall, and it stood open. Beyond was a road, and then the low walls of the gardens of a pair of stone houses. Mark leaned out to take a better look. There was a shed in each garden, perhaps 10 yards of vegetable plots. The houses had 2 stories and dormer windows in their high tiled roofs. A bullet drove into the wall just by his head, throwing off a puff of dust. Mark ducked back down. His men were coming up around him. Evans was in the lead. "Keep your heads down!" Thomas was yelling as a burst of fire came from the top windows of one of the houses. A man fell, but had just skidded and slipped in the mud. Wild-eyed, he crawled to join them. "Anyone got smoke bombs?" Mark asked. Thomas produced one and a corporal had another. "Good. When I say, chuck them over the wall." Mark counted and saw that he had 13 men, wondered where that was unlucky, and then remembered that he was there to make 14. He had little idea where the rest of the platoon had gone. He certainly had not seen so many get hit. There were 2 Bren teams. "That corner," he said, pointing at one of them, then turned and sent the other one to the opposite side of the gate. "When we're ready, open up and hit the windows. Get their heads down as much as you can. Understood? Good." Another cluster of shells came over and burst at the far end of the orchard. Mark thought of his wounded men, worried but could do nothing for them. They lobbed the smoke grenades, waited, heard the fizzings as the white clouds started to blossom. "Now fire!" he yelled at the Bren gun teams, and they started their steady, thumping rhythm. A Spandau answered, chipping shards from the top of the wall. One man ducked back, swearing, but the others were still firing. "Follow me!" Mark yelled as loud as he could and pelted through the open gateway, heading straight for the garden wall. The white smoke was all around him, and he coughed as he ran. We'll stop at that point because, again, we could go on. This would be a very long section if we kept on doing it, and also things happen, and some of the descriptions are perhaps a little too graphic for YouTube, rather than reading a novel when you know what you're going to be getting. At least have some idea. I also quite like the point that it ends with the last paragraph starts off with Mark yelling out, "Follow me," because to a great extent that's the officer's job. Now, Mark isn't 20 in the story, and that was true of a lot of infantry subalterns. They had, in many cases, come straight from school. There'd be other men who'd been promoted from the ranks, might be a little bit older. Earlier in the war there was probably more variety, but by this time you'd either been promoted if you'd served for a while, or you were a casualty, and you were being replaced by younger men like Mark. There's a contrast with people like Coop Buchanan, the Canadian Canlone officer who's in charge of Judd's platoon, who's a mature man, a family man, because he's taken a step down in rank to see active service. And quite a few of the men who came on that scheme did so. But on the whole, your infantry subalterns are extraordinarily young. There are lots of very good books about this, and we'll talk more about some of those, but it's also, again, I've mentioned before, and you probably can't see it very well, it's a little bit tasteless, but I managed to find my old platoon sweatshirt from Recruit Company, Sir John Moore Company, when I was in Combray Platoon in the Oxford University Officer Training Corps back in the 90s, and I thought, well, I'll put that on for this talk. The training we were given then was very, very similar to the training they'd had in the Second World War. And this struck me again, doing the research for this story. I came across a copy of this, Infantry Training, Part 8, Fieldcraft, Battle Drills, Section and Platoon Tactics, 1944. One of the many pamphlets they were producing to train and educate this vastly expanded conscript army that had developed, that the army was not really prepared for in 1939, had to learn different techniques of training, as also the war was developing, because many of the ideas of 1939 proved not to work or to be impractical for the sort of soldiers they were dealing with. This one is actually a Canadian edition, published in March 1944, but taken straight from the British Army's manual. And looking at the topics within it, you get a lot of things like, preparing for battle, camouflage, platoon moving along a road, section in the attack, platoon moving across country, platoon in the attack, patrol for reconnaissance, fighting patrols, house clearing, all of these things. Much of it is very, very similar. The basic structure of an infantry platoon was starting to change. We were a little bit late in the OTC, as I think I mentioned in the video about Bill Judd and the Bren Gunners War, and that we had just gone to 2 fire teams rather than a gun group and a rifle group in a section. And the aim was more overtly for a section of 8 rather than the ideal of the theoretical 10 of the Second World War era. But you still have 3 of them, and then a small HQ group for the platoon with commander, the 2IC, second in command, the sergeant, who will, the nature of the British Army, what is, be experienced and be the man on whom the young subaltern relies, very, very heavily, the far more experienced, capable men. And somehow or other the British Army, throughout so much of its history, seems to have turned out these incredibly good NCOs, sergeants, warrant officers and the like, and thank goodness for that. But anyone who's served at any level, they're very impressive people, and as a young officer or trainee officer, you have that sense of inferiority that you know that if you've got an ounce of sense, you rely on them, and the tone of their voice of when they tell you you're doing something damn stupid. And it's also, as an aside, putting on my other hat, you see that reflected in Roman army studies, that the generation of scholars who'd either been in the Second World War or done national service afterwards emphasize centurions as non-commissioned officers, as sergeants, as sergeant majors, I think because they realized centurions were important with the Roman army, but just assumed they must be as good and of the same type, and experienced former rankers of their British army, the army they'd experienced. I don't think that's actually true in the Roman case. I think the society is rather different, but anyway, that's the side. Sorry, back to 1944, which is what I should be talking about, but you know me, I tend to wander. So it was interesting that there's an element where, when I'm writing about Mark stuff, there are things that I've gone through some of the training to do. I didn't go to Sandhurst, I didn't get my commission, I didn't stay on in the tier or anything. I had a not quite 2 years experience doing this whilst I was doing my doctorate, and as I mentioned in the other one, it's a marvellous way of rounding off an education, getting a dash of military life. It's also vital for a military historian that you start to get some sense of how things work, how groups are motivated, how things are organised, the difficulty of planning, of logistics, the practical element. Most of the exercises we do in the OTC, often you do a weekend or a day where you're concentrating on section battle drills. You might then go up to platoon battle drills. I think the largest exercise I was ever involved in involved 2 companies, plus we had the odd vehicles and other stuff turning up. And those 2 companies provided was basically all the OTC in its various forms was out there. It was interesting to see how much slower everything was, how much longer it took to do things, and the simple orders that could cause confusion. For instance, at one point there were 2 platoons of us from our company. We were going in Indian file, single file, on either side of a fairly wide track on a training area, and that's the one arm up, that's the symbol for that. And then the person who was leading decided to, for each one, it's 2 if you're doing that, he suddenly gave the signal for us all to go into one line, which meant the 2 platoons merged so that alternately you were from a different section of a different platoon. Very simple mistake, very simple order, but it took time to shake that out again, to sort things out again. Now, we were inexperienced at operating at that level. So while with Bill Judd's thing, I've tried to give a reflection of training in Britain before they get to Normandy, because the Glamorgans, the fictional infantry battalion that these 2 characters are in, don't land on D-Day, they land later in June. Again, as a reminder that most of the army did not land on D-Day. The vast majority of people to fight in the Battle of Normandy got there much, much later, and even those who landed on D-Day, they didn't all land in the early waves. They didn't necessarily face fighting on the beaches. Then they might have faced shelling and that sort of thing as well. But by then, the beaches were cleared by mid to late morning. I've done a little bit in the earlier sections on trying to explain how Mark was involved in training the platoon, reminding them they're waiting to go and they're repeating the drills they've done and again. So we've got a bit, there's even a few, not quite quotes. I did it on the basis of what I thought someone would remember when they tried to memorize a manual like this. So when they go through the formations with Mark and his Sergeant Dawson at that point, Dalton rather, not Dawson. Dawson was a character from a comic I used to read as a boy. It was D-Day Dawson, I remember that. Anyway, so, whereas Dalton, I suspect that name came from the Dalton, the VC at Rorke's Drift, the former sergeant who was then a commissary by that time, but had been a sergeant in the light infantry, and they sort of added at the last minute and didn't quite get right in the film Zulu. But anyway, very interesting character who was clearly key to the defence. You go through some of this. I haven't done lots of it, but I've tried to reflect the route marches, the battle drills, the men singing, because that's the only way to stay awake when you're just pounding along, and that danger of falling asleep on your feet. And it happened once to me, and I remember, I've heard my father and other veterans talking about it, of how, particularly in those days when you had the heel of the military boot had a steel rim, so if you did fall, if you passed out on a long march volley, you would probably hit the heel coming up and smash your jaw, smash your teeth, that sort of thing. These things happened. Give that sense of fatigue, of the immense period. These men had been training for years in many, many cases. Even the least experienced of them, like Mark and Bill, had been with their unit for many, many months, a year or more, before they actually went to Normandy and started to see active service. So I've tried to give a reflection of that. This is something where I've had what tiny experience I have had, I could draw upon for how they do things. It's also, being an OTC is a very interesting way of looking at leadership, because you've got lots of inexperienced but very keen people trying to lead other inexperienced and keen people, because the rank and file of our platoons were not proper soldiers, we were all officer cadets. And you saw how some people shouted a lot but only made things more chaotic, how some were very, very quiet and yet everything around them seemed to work and seemed to get done. And the others who had the balance, they were quite noisy, they were quite vocal, they were encouraging, but it worked. And some of these things are things you're born with, a particular voice. Some people can just sound petulant. Others sound authoritative, but also the confidence to do it. And even little things, I remember one lecture saying, well, if you don't think you're a good leader, act as if you are. Pretend to be. And that can often work. And a lot of this is about behaving. I've tried to with Mark. He is someone, again, it comes back to this follow me. The platoon sergeant is going to be doing a lot of the more technical stuff, is going to be there advising very strongly the administration of the platoon, how you handle the men, all this sort of thing. And when you had a good one, and most of them were pretty good, they will do the bulk of it. Human beings are human beings, not everyone's perfect. There would be some who would be too severe, too lax, some who just had been promoted above their ability, as happens in every walk of life. So we have that, you have that dynamic of the relationship with the platoon sergeant. The organisation of a battalion at this time is 4 rifle companies. In each company there are 3 rifle platoons, and then a HQ group, company HQ on top of that. You're moving towards this, everything being in 3s, which was becoming the sort of fairly standard. The British were a little bit slow to get there, and they still had 4 companies in at least a rifle battalion. Some of the motorised battalions were organised on a 3-company basis, but ordinary infantry battalions had 4, A, B, C and D. Again, there'll be a few regiments, being peculiar as they are, there would be some exceptions to that, and some would do it at a regimental level, so you get higher letters in the alphabet coming through. But basically that's the organisation you would know, so that Judd's in 9 platoon, that means he's in A company, Mark is in D company, and that's reflected the number of his platoon. But there was that standardisation, along with all the little peculiarities of cap badges and shoulder flashes that is baked into the tradition of the British Army. But this was a fairly standardised organisation. Now, early in the war, it was fairly common for a platoon commander to be given a radio and a wireless operator, so that he could be contacted directly by company HQ, perhaps even by higher up the battalion. By 1944 they'd realised that this wasn't a very good idea, that it robbed them of initiative, and it meant that higher commanders were interfering too much. And while the great emphasis is obviously on German mission-based tactics and all this sort of thing, and the idea they devolved a lot of authority to a unit responsible, you go and do this, how you do it is your problem. British Army doesn't really work like that. It's got more organised plans, but there is still an element where there is initiative given to the junior leader. He's got a task to do, but he is not directly controlled. So there is a lot for infantry officers. There's a lot of running around, there's a lot of shouting, there's a lot of sending messages by runner, rather than talking over the radio. So at platoon commander level, you're not really involved in that radio network. That only in exceptional circumstances. The person who might be involved in it, if you've got one, is the FOO, the Forward Observation Officer of the Artillery. We'll come back to gunners in a minute, because obviously they're vital to the way the British infantry worked in Normandy. And when I say British, I'm writing about British characters, but essentially the Canadian Army did everything in pretty much the same way. A lot of innovations would come from the Canadians, be copied by the British and vice versa. But essentially it's the same organisation, same equipment, even if there are cultural differences and just attitudes that were slightly different. A lot is very, very similar. And as I've tried to make the point repeatedly in these videos, the Canadians simply don't get enough credit for the burden they carried in Normandy and the achievements they made then and in the rest of North-East Europe, and more generally in the wider war. As I've said before, the British always feel the Americans are trying to take all the glory, but to some extent we do the same with the Canadians. Sometimes there isn't enough attention paid. It's hard to cover everybody at the same time all the time, and there are good reasons why everybody does these things, and in the end it's up to you if you want to you make whatever story you want, or whatever one you feel if it's filmmaking that the market wants. But it's good to remind ourselves of the truth and the reality that there were, it's a lot less simple than that. A lot of other people played a role. I don't really have time in the book. The Poles get mentioned once or twice, but only in sort of conversation, because the Polish Armoured Division didn't arrive till late in my story and wasn't really involved in any of the actions where I have my characters. But again, played a very important role. So, Mark is platoon commander. He's one pip on each shoulder. He's a second lieutenant. He's the lowest of the low in one sense in the British Army, and that although you're an officer and you have status, you really can't push this authority too far because you haven't yet earned it. Again, I remember this from the OTCs, that some of the warrant officers, although they were obliged to call you sir, it was Mr. Goldsworthy, sir, there would be a lot of disdain, disgust, disappointment, insult that they could put in. They just add the sir at the end. And you knew that, on the whole, you deserved it as well. And you tried to do better. You wanted to live up to their expectations. There's a lot of that, the way morale and soldiers function, that everybody is trying to live up to those around them. So you have your comrades in the rifle section, you don't want to let them down. The burden for someone like Mark, particularly a serious, he's a very well-meaning individual. He's a nice bloke. Mark, he's trying his best. He's not someone with, all the gifts in life. He feels he's the sort of the neglected one of his family. His brothers are taller than him, better looking than him, more athletic than him. He's just okay at everything. But he does try hard, and he's sincere, and he means well. And it's something of an innocent. He's quite an old-fashioned. He's believed all the things they've told him at school, all the things his parents have told him, and believes them utterly. And this is a more cynical age, but to some extent, while you can look at people like that as naive, there's a lot more that's admirable about them than someone who is simply cynical for the sake of being cynical and never achieves anything and never does anything positive themselves. It's all very well laughing at the world and mocking it, but and sometimes you have to. But in the end, we need people who actually go out and do things, and that's most of all true in a war, but it's just true in life in general. So Mark is someone who has to be careful. He can't overstep the limited status he has, because he hasn't yet proved himself. That will change as he gets experience, but so he's got two things. It's one difference. If you're in position of authority, if you're in charge, then you've got to think of other things, and to some extent it helps them to cope with the trauma of battle, because they're very busy. They've got to think of other people, they've got to give orders to other people, and he knows he's perhaps not quite so introverted as James, who's worried all the time that he'll make the wrong decisions, he'll get people killed because of some mistake, some bad order he's given or something he hasn't done. Mark feels that a little bit, it's less so, but he does worry. He wants to do the right thing. He wants to, he cares about his platoon, he respects them, he can see them all. It's this oddity that while you would have quite a lot of conscripts of a similar age, you would also have older men. And because if you'd come from the fairly sheltered middle-class background, many of the people who were working class would seem older and more mature than you because they'd had a tougher life. And they'd left school at 14 or at the most at 16, and they'd been working. The whole point with James and Mark is that they've never done a day's work in their life. They've never had an ordinary job. They have been schoolboys and they've gone straight into the army. That's their experience of the world, and yet you're supposed to give orders to people who might be married, might have children, might have been very successful in a trade, worked in a factory, whatever it might be. There are some very capable people out there, and you're supposed to give them orders. But also the system is they're looking for you. They need that direction. Somebody's got to be in charge. So there is the technical side, there's the tactics. I've tried to reflect how a platoon in this period operated, both as itself but also as part of the wider battalion. And again, a lot of this was the sort of stuff I'd been trained to do, or was going through training to do. I remember at the time reading books about the Second World War, and a lot of things just struck me because you would have been on the last weekend or the last drill night. You would be having an instruction about the different types of patrol, the different types of defensive position, O groups, the orders group, how orders are passed on, how you get people to do things, how long it takes, the resentment, the sense where people feel they're being picked on as an individual or as a section or as a group, they're being asked to do more than everyone else. There's that awkwardness that's inherent in people in general. I think particularly in the British Army, that sense of, bit of fair play. And these are soldiers as well, less willing to obey blindly than those of the First World War, because they'd grown up with the stories of fathers, of uncles, those who'd come back, of some of the foul-ups of the First World War and the appalling casualties. You could argue that the First World War generation went off and volunteered naively, not knowing what to expect. The Second World War generation, fewer of them volunteered, most of them waited for their call-up to come, but they had more sense. They had been told a lot more stories. They'd seen the war memorials. They'd been there on Armistice Day. They'd seen the long list of names in these tiny village memorials of all those who'd fallen. So they had more sense. You have a feeling more throughout that it's an army that just wants to get a nasty job done. There are some, particularly the youngsters, that can find it exciting, that get more committed. There are the natural soldiers, but they're always a minority. Most people are just doing a job, and they want to get it done. And they have a feeling, that sense, yes, we've got to do this, it's the right thing to do, it's a necessary job. They don't then go talking about themselves as, leading a crusade in Europe. They're not, whatever the authorities are trying to tell them about their role, they're fairly cynical about it, but it's cynicism that in a sense is earned, because they're still going to do the job. And I think most of them are absolutely certain their side is right, their side will win in the end. It's going to be hard, but we'll get there. I've tried to convey that mood, that sense of a different mentality. And someone like Mark, thinks, oh yeah, wouldn't it be marvellous to be a hero, come back with a few scars and impress all the girls. That lasts for about 30 seconds once he comes under fire, when he realises how random the chances are. You simply, life and death depends on where you happen to be standing. If you're in a slit trench over there, a mortar bomb lands smack bang in it and there's nothing left inside other than bits. If you're in the slit trench over here, they land nearby but nothing actually hits you and you're perfectly safe. The accidents that will happen, the coming under fire. The other thing I wanted to convey in these battle descriptions here and elsewhere is that you don't know a lot of what's going on. And I saw this even on exercise, of how difficult it was, even when it was set up in fairly simplistic ways for the benefit of young officer cadets. You couldn't necessarily see where the enemy were, where they were firing from. And once you got down in the grass, then your visibility went to almost nil. Again, it's the difference with James. He's commanding a tank. He's in permanent communication with the tanks of his troop, with the squadron, with the regiment. He hears a lot, sometimes too much information of what's going on. It can blot out and stop him from hearing what he needs to know. A rifleman, a Bren gunner like Judd, knows next to nothing. The broader plan is, there'll be some simple explanation of it, but he doesn't really know and doesn't really care to a great extent what's going on. What matters is what's happening to 9 Platoon for him and his section and his muckers around him. With a platoon commander like Mark, they've got a sense of the plan, but it's very much what is 17 Platoon doing in the wider context of what D Company is doing, and then more broadly what the battalion's doing. And there will have been, again, through the O Group procedure and all, the way you plan out that systematic way of doing things, which again has not really changed at all. I found some notes of mine where I was going through looking at this 1944 manual. Yep, that's basically the same thing, the same order of things. There's a different tone in the 1940 war, but perhaps because it was more, in one sense, it's a little bit more sort of rousing, but also it's more immediate. It's very much of its time, but the basics of what they're doing is the same. And I remember reading the Not Ordinary Men, a novel about Burma, written by a platoon commander, and it just struck me again and again, these were exactly the things I was being trained to do. And you could also see the problems. This is how the training is supposed to work, but in the context of a battle, how it breaks down, how you have to improvise, and how you just hope things work out. The other classic one, of course, of a platoon commander is Sidney Jarry's 18 Platoon, superb book that used a lot for this, but rely upon it. He emphasises the messiness of it all. There's the theory you should have 3 sections of 10 men, they should have these weapons, but in reality, as Northwest European campaign continued, to get 18 or 20, you're probably lucky. That's about the average a platoon is actually operating with, partly because you've got men left out of battle to make sure that they don't get wiped out. You've got somebody to rebuild the battalion if things go really pear-shaped, but also because of losses and casualties, and the replacement system just isn't able to meet these requirements. So it all looks very neat on paper. And there's some interesting books on tactics and others that I looked through and did all of this, and as well as the memoirs. And there's another one, Accidental Warrior, which is a superb account, very vivid, of first of all working with a mortar platoon and then a rifle platoon in a battalion in Normandy. So there's lots of very good information about this, and I've tried to reflect the sort of things that a platoon commander is doing. And the job essentially puts you at greatest risk of anybody in the battalion. Even though you're not wandering around by a wireless operator with a big aerial sticking up that makes you an obvious target, even though in this case, in that particular bit I read, Mark ends up with a pistol, most units started removing insignia. Officers were carrying rifles rather than necessarily Sten guns, or trying to look like ordinary soldiers as much as possible, because otherwise you're the obvious target, and any sniper worth his salt is going to take you out first. In the same way, the convention, you don't salute even on exercise, let alone in the field, because that just draws attention to people in authority. Nevertheless, you're the person who's got to stand up and say, follow me. That's really your job, to get that platoon moving. There's an element of motivation. It's almost like the 18th, early 19th century, the formation, where the officer would be slightly in front of the company, the sergeant would be behind. The idea is he stops people from going back and makes sure they're organised as they go forward, but it's the officer, it's the old, Rifleman Costello talks about, they divided officers into two types. It's those who say go on and those who say come on. And it's the second ones, the ones that say come on, that you follow. There is that very basic thing of inspiration. Somebody has to go first. You can see this in many walks of life. And if somebody doesn't go first, everyone else will haver for quite a while and not necessarily go. So that's very dangerous, because again and again you have to stand up and go forward, and you are the obvious person to take out as far as the enemy is concerned. Even when you're not in a major action like that, part of a major assault, the platoon commander has to move around. You are statistically more likely to go out on patrols than anybody else, because you need somebody in authority. The sergeant will do it some of the time, but there's only the two of you, and the more experience you get at something, the more likely you are to be called upon to do it next time when it's important, because you've done it well before. They want the job done well, therefore they're willing to risk you again and again. So you have patrolling you're going to be involved in more heavily. And all the time you're getting called to O groups to do things. You're not necessarily doing all the hard work of slogging and digging a slit trench for yourself. That's going to be left to your batman, to others helping out, because you're being called away to get briefings, to go to O groups to do this. You're touring the positions, even in a defensive position, because you're there to be seen, to encourage others. So the casualty rate for infantrymen in Normandy is very, very high. It's the highest rate, other than infantry platoon commanders, subalterns, junior officers. It's very risky for the company officers and above as well, but platoon commanders in particular, and the attritional rate is appalling. And there is even a case where somebody arrives at the unit and they've been told at the depot that, oh well, you might last a week or so. This comes down to one of the points raised in the earlier thing, the life expectancy, at least in terms of remaining with your unit and remaining active, of an infantry subaltern in the Battle for Normandy, the British Army, was worse than it had been on the Somme in 1916. Because it's more open, you're more visible, and you've got to go first. That's your job. So they are killed, they are wounded, they have mental breakdowns faster than everybody else. And on many occasions, you get it in the book, platoons will be led very well by sergeants, but they're running the same level of risk as well. They're vital, they keep the unit going, but they get killed and wounded at a very high rate. So it's why a lot of decorations go to these junior leaders, because without them, you simply can't keep the men moving forward, can't keep the momentum going. A theme you get again and again, it's reminiscent of earlier periods, even though now everyone is spread out. You're not in close formation. You need to be spread out, because otherwise you're just too much of a target, too vulnerable to mortar bombs, to artillery. But you need to be close together, and that you can hear the orders, you can be urged forward by somebody's example. And it isn't always the platoon commander who goes first. Sometimes somebody, for whatever reasons, an ordinary soldier, a corporal, whoever it might be, will stand up and will go first. And they either die or get wounded, or they win a decoration, or at least they win the respect of everyone. There's an interesting survey report on British Army combat effectiveness in Sicily and southern Italy that was compiled and published by the end of 1943, I think, late 43, early 44, that sums it up as the system, although it should be fire and manoeuvre, that's what the battle drills are supposed to teach, actually it becomes guts and manoeuvre, because they estimated that you had about half a dozen people in every platoon who would always go forward. And that included usually the subaltern in charge, the platoon sergeant, and then a few others who were just braver and more willing to be bold as individuals and would go forward when you came under fire. The bulk of the platoon that waited for an example, and then 3 or 4 or maybe more who tended always to bug out, who would always fail, just couldn't cope with the stress. But to their credit, kept going into the assault. They would break down. They wouldn't be able to lead. They would often flee, and it depended on whether the main body of a platoon followed them and ran away, or followed the ones who'd gone forward. But the thing it also noted is those few who naturally went forward, they suffer a far higher casualty rate than everyone else. So you're using up your most vital asset, the men who are bolder, the natural fighters, the ones who will go forward because they take more risks. Now you have to attack and you have to go on, and that's what it's about. There's an element where the British Army has almost become, the infantry have become a bodyguard and a way of getting your artillery observers further forward where they can see more and call in shell fire to kill more Germans. The British Army is still fairly rigid in its tactics. Now, that's partly a reflection of the immense expansion of the army from the small peacetime army of 1939 and before into the conscript army, where people are coming without the background of any sort of military experience. You've got to train them in ways, and you've got to train them largely by people who are not themselves very experienced, to become moderately effective. And there's a sense where they try and create a standard simple drills, and Alan Brooke, Montgomery, people like this, all queen advocates of this. Keep it simple so they can do it. Drum it into them. Now that can sometimes rob them of initiative. It can sometimes mean that battalion attacks and brigade attacks are rather too formal, 2 companies up, 2 back, either 1 platoon up or 2 up and 1 back, whatever it might be, and that you hit something, okay, let's try and find a flank and work around. You see this even in the parachute battalions at Arnhem, that they're doing things in a fairly formulaic way, even though these are an elite. Nevertheless, the doctrine is still quite rigid in a way that probably was clumsier than, say, German army doctrine, though again, we'll talk more about the different armies in another video, but don't get too excited and don't, depict the Wehrmacht as all singing, all dancing, because they made lots of mistakes as well. But in a sense, it's a reflection of the First World War idea that you need artillery to devastate the enemy defences, so you need to fit in with the fire plan of the artillery, like we had Mark and his platoon following the creeping barrage. You've got to keep up close, because if you're not close enough, then the barrage clears, the Germans have time to shake off the dust, come out of their trenches, man the machine guns again and mow you down. First day of the Somme sort of thing. But it's still true in 1944. If you're very close, you're risking casualties from your own artillery fire, but the argument is those will be fewer than the ones you'd suffer if you let the Germans recover. So you move forward into a position, you've then got to storm that position. Now, hopefully, as in the passage I read, they don't see a live German. They're fired at by MG42s, by Spandaus. Mark thinks there are 2, there might be more, he doesn't know where they're coming from. That's the experience again and again. You come under fire, but you don't necessarily know where it's from. When you reach a position, the enemy have already gone, because if they haven't gone, they're probably still manning those guns and you might not get there. There will sometimes be the tough fighting to clear a position. We'll have aspects of that in the novel. But quite often, all you see are the enemy dead and the debris they've left behind. Another side note, this is something I came across in Alexander McKee's book, Humble of Victory, years ago, and it stuck in my mind, and you see it now and again mentioned in personal accounts. It's one of those oddities that you don't expect in 20th century warfare, but both sides felt they could smell the other. That if Germans were near, you could smell them, and if you came into a position they'd occupied, there was the smell of the Hun, or whatever you might call it, and the Germans said the same about British and American positions, that there were slightly different smells. Now, it's probably partly to do with diet, the sort of rations that you're getting, because that's going to affect your odour. It's also to do with the anti-mustard gas treatment that was on British Army uniforms. Germans have more problems with lice in Normandy. It's again another thing that's picked out, that when German prisoners were taken, they had to delouse them pretty quickly. Generally speaking, the Allied armies were much, much freer of these sorts of vermin by this time. They had better, the uniforms were better made, better treated, and the availability of insecticides and things were... But the Germans tend to get lice when they're in the field for any length of time. German diet is also rather different, not so good. So it's almost a sort of primeval thing that you can smell the enemy. There's something sinister, there's something different. And again, you'll find in accounts of Burma that the Japanese smelt different to everybody else. So again, an interesting thing I wanted to put in, but I wanted that sense of a battlefield where you're coming under fire, you're being attacked, but you don't know where the enemy are. You know, I'm going for that orchard, I'm going for those buildings, I'm trying to capture that position, that's what I've been told to do, but I don't know whether the enemy's there. Somebody's shooting at me, I don't know where they're shooting from. It's very hard to locate the enemy. It's one of the big problems that you have with depictions on screen and this sort of thing, is that obviously the filmmakers need the audience to understand what's happening. So everybody tends to stand closer together on camera so it looks more impressive, but also the enemy are far more visible. And you get lots of, almost people standing shoulder to shoulder in line, blasting at each other at various times in a way that would not be a terribly good idea in modern warfare. But it's to explain, to make you understand. With a novel, I've tried to give more of a flavour of the memoirs, the accounts where they don't know what's going on. And there will be plenty of attacks where a platoon suffers significant casualties and they've never seen an enemy. They've come under fire, they've come under machine gun fire, mortar fire, perhaps small arms fire as well. Even if they succeed in taking the position, the only enemy they see are dead or wounded or prisoners. The ones who've surrendered, they don't fight it. That's the nature of a lot of modern warfare. It's less dramatic perhaps than Hollywood, but that's the reality, and that's what the book's trying to convey. So I've tried to do that in these accounts and give that sense of confusion of somebody running around, somebody trying to inspire, and someone who is basically a kid, and yet they're doing this job, and they may not be perfect, but they're trying, and you have to admire them for that. But you also have to see how it works, how other people all have their role to play. Other people do things, whether it's the sergeants, the corporals, the lance corporals, and the ordinary soldiers. And the moments where there are a few occasions where it's just somebody who, for whatever reason, decides to get up and fight, or works out where the enemy are, gets around the flank, these sorts of things. Trying to convey the chaos, that it isn't neat, that the battle drills you're all trained are all very well, but at most they give you basic principles. They almost never work in the simple way that you're trained to do it and the way they do in exercises and this sort of thing. It's just that real life is far more chaotic, confusing, unpredictable than that. And that you don't necessarily succeed every time, but when you do, when you take the position, you bring up your forward observers if they're not there already. While we talk about rigid Allied tactics, German doctrine emphasized immediate counterattack. If you lose a position, and the doctrine was, and this had developed from sort of later 1917, 1918, carried through into the Second World War, you don't occupy your forward positions in great strength, but in a fairly limited way, and rely a lot on machine guns to hold the enemy back, but you have fewer people exposed to the barrages that are coming in. However, once the enemy have taken there, before they can do again the, whether it was section battle drills, platoon battle drills, or whatever, going through the list of things you had to do, always finished with reorg in my day, and it's there, they're the same. The reorganization. You've got to consolidate. You've got to get sorted out again. You've got to get people in position. You've got to work out how we're going to defend this position we've just taken. You are vulnerable. You can be kicked out much more easily than if you're given hours, let alone days, to prepare proper defence. So German doctrine was to hit them while they were still off balance, and then keep hitting them and hit them very hard, which is fine and it often worked, but it also meant your people are coming out of any hidden or fortified positions they've got, they're going into the open to attack. And the British Army doctrine that again has developed with the BEF in the First World War and continues through, becomes more and more sophisticated during the Second World War, is to then use your artillery to pound them. and it comes back to this point, there are more gunners in Normandy than there are infantrymen. And the weight of fire that could be called down by a forward observer, who might be a captain, might even be or junior to that, can be calling in a regiment of artillery, even a division's worth of artillery, sometimes even a corps' worth of artillery, so that the Germans suffer their heaviest losses when they counterattack. And the fact that they counterattack, yes, it does mean a lot of Allied offensives don't succeed, don't take as much ground as they could, but in the end, attritionally, they are wearing down these German units, particularly their infantry, very, very quickly. You know, as Normandy develops, an infantry division, German infantry division that arrives in Normandy rarely lasts more than a week before it's almost combat ineffective, particularly if there's any intensive fighting, because their infantry are just ground down, and often your infantry divisions are lowest priority. They're more inclined to surrender as well when the Allies, the infantry, get to their position. And you're using your panzer divisions from the start to plug gaps in the line, and they are being worn down because they're not... You know, the Germans are never able to form everything up and mount a large-scale counterattack, but corps level, in any sort of chaotic way. The divisions are never complete, they're always scattered, there isn't time, and when they do it, they are absolutely hammered by the Allied artillery. It comes back to, I think I mentioned this earlier, but it never struck me till I read it in Canadian book, talking about how all the artillery to come ashore on D-Day itself, on Juno Beach and Gold as well, was self-propelled, because you wanted to get your guns ashore and into firing positions as soon as possible, so that when the German armour came to counterattack, the guns were there to hammer them. And this is what they did, and it worked. It's crude, it's a sledgehammer thing, but it's a sledgehammer that's directed very, very carefully. Artillery direction had become very sophisticated science by this period, and the Allies, the Canadians pioneered a lot of these techniques, the British Royal Artillery as well, the Americans doing things slightly differently but effectively as well. This became the big means of killing Germans, wearing down the German army. So people like Mark and his platoon are doing an important job and they're attacking, but they're not going to win the battle on their own. They are actually there really almost to get the artillery into a position where it can slaughter the Germans, and that's what they did. So I've tried to convey a picture where battalion attacks break down, things go wrong, people run away, people get confused. That tendency, you come under fire, you go to ground. And it's very hard to get up and do that. So I didn't want Mark to be a hero. He stands up and everybody rushes off and follows him and they storm the position with a few grenades and some machine gun fire in best on-screen tradition. I wanted to have times where he stands up, says, "Follow me," and hardly anybody does. The Germans start firing at them again and he goes down, everybody else goes down. Because it isn't easy. These things are difficult, and he's, in a sense, he's rolling the dice each time, and if he's unlucky, he's going to get killed or wounded every time he does that, because he is an obvious target. So that's what I've tried to reflect in Mark's War. I've wanted to give an idea of the subaltern's experience. As I say, the paperback of the novel is coming out tomorrow. Now, I know most people on this site are probably more ancient history orientated than towards this stuff, but I'm afraid it's my channel. I'm going to be talking about things, particularly when books are being released, but the things that interest me, and I hope are of general interest to people interested in history. I will try always to be that element on, yes, this might be a novel, but I'm trying to base it on understanding of actual events, of what really happened. So that's Mark's War, that's the Infantry Subaltern's War. Tomorrow there'll be, for the release date, something a little bit special. I'm going to read the epilogue that I wrote for the novel that was never actually hasn't been published. It wasn't included. I decided not to do it in the end, but I always thought, well, I'd release it at some point, so those who want to know what I felt happened to my characters afterwards, this is my version of it. So we'll get that tomorrow. So again, as with the reading earlier, apologise that it's only me and not somebody professional and knowing what they're doing. Reading this, I know I'm too fast when I read. But that's partly reflecting. I tend to speak too fast when I'm just talking. After that, the rest of the month will be Roman history, and we'll see. We'll try and do a few things for Christmas and the festive season. That I'll see if I can get more videos out and maybe some more Q&A and that sort of thing, but we'll see. There's some other ideas I've got, but for the moment I'm recording this a month before it's actually going to be posted. Thanks for watching. I hope those of you who have read the novel Hill 112 have enjoyed it. As I say, I think it's the most accurate thing I've written, because the material to go on is far fuller than you've got for the ancient world when it comes to writing fiction. But also I hope there's enough of a taster here for those who might be interested to think, oh yeah, I'll give that a go. Paperback out tomorrow, so that makes it all, you know, reasonable and affordable in a way that having a punt on a hardback novel is taking more of a risk, whether you like it or not, and it's more awkward to carry around and all that sort of thing. So anyway, that's it for today. Hill 112, Mark's War, an infantry subaltern in Normandy. Thanks for watching.